For those just joining us, please note that everyone is currently muted to reduce background noise. Good morning and welcome to our Alaska Collaborative on Health and the Environment teleconference titled The Future of Public Health Under President Trump, How Sidelining Science Threatens Vulnerable Communities and Children. My name is Diana DeFazio, and on behalf of Alaska Community Action on Toxics, I'll be facilitating today's call. CHE-Alaska is a regional partnership group of the National Collaborative on Health and the Environment. CHE-Alaska aims to advance knowledge and effective action to address growing concerns about the links between human health and environmental factors. You can find more information at akaction.org and healthandenvironment.org. And today we are honored to have Dr. Juan Declet-Barreto and Dr. Frederica Perera presenting. And everyone who signed up for the call received a link to the PDF of the presentation last night. We did add another presentation this morning in a separate email. And then just a few minutes ago, I updated Dr. Declet-Barreto's presentation, so you will need to download it again if you downloaded it earlier today or yesterday. We just want to be sure everyone is on the same page, and our speakers will say next slide, so you can click through your PDF and follow along as they present. As with all of our CHE-Alaska teleconferences, we will leave some time at the end for discussion and questions from participants. And now it is my pleasure to welcome and introduce our first speaker. Dr. Juan Declet-Barreto joined the Union of Concerned Scientists in 2016 as a Joint Kendall Science Fellow for the Climate and Energy Program and the Center for Science and Democracy. He partners with environmental justice groups and activists to research the potential effects of carbon trading on disadvantaged communities as individual states begin implementation of the EPA's Clean Power Plan. Before joining Union of Concerned Scientists, he spent 2 years as a Climate and Health Research Fellow with the Natural Resources Defense Council. Dr. Declet-Barreto earned a PhD in Environmental Social Sciences and an MA and BS degrees in Geography and an Associate's degree in Geographic Information Systems from Arizona State University. And I'd like to welcome you, Dr. Declet-Barreto, and you may go ahead and begin.
Thank you, Diana, for that introduction. Good morning to everybody, and thank you for inviting me to share some of this very timely information. I'd like to thank CHE-Alaska for inviting me to share very timely and important information on the threats to public and environmental health that we are seeing under the current administration. I will share with you some of the key findings of a recent report released by the Center for Science and Democracy at the Union of Concerned Scientists, in which the authors, my colleagues, present evidence of political interference in science that is threatening public and environmental health. Can we move on to this next slide, please? A clear pattern has emerged over the first 6 months of the Trump presidency. Multiple actions by his administration are eroding the ability of science, facts, and evidence to inform policy decisions, leaving us more vulnerable to threats to public health and the environment. The Trump administration is attempting to delegitimize science. It is giving industries more ability to influence how and what science is used for in policymaking, and it is creating a hostile environment for federal agency scientists who serve the public. This is a new era in which political interference in science is more likely and more frequent, and will present serious risks to the health and safety of the American people. The science community and the general public have responded vigorously to these threats, standing up for science, calling out alternative facts, articulating the importance of science-based policymaking, and marching in the streets. Next slide. I'll share with you a partial timeline of political interference in science that the Center for Science and Democracy has assembled in the new report, Sidelining Science, how the Trump administration has been interfering in science and policymaking. And I've outlined or highlighted some of the some key events in this timeline. On January 3rd, House Republicans revived the Holman Rule, which allows Congress to target specific initiatives and reduce the salaries of individuals in federal service. On January 11th, the Centers for Disease Control canceled the long-planned Climate and Health Summit, depriving public health scientists and researchers from communicating the latest research findings that can help protect Americans from climate impacts. Specifically worrisome for Alaskan communities was that the EPA recently pulled its staff from the Alaska Forum on the Environment, where the EPA typically has had a very strong presence. Other examples include the refusal of EPA Administrator Pruitt to ban the use of the pesticide chlorpyrifos, contradicting the findings of EPA scientists that the pesticide is toxic, harmful to humans, and especially threatens children. If we add to this the intent of the administration to pull the U.S. out of the Paris Climate Agreement, we can see a clear pattern of hostility to science that is harming the everyday lives of Americans. Next slide, please. On March 29, 2017, EPA Administrator Scott Pruitt announced that his agency would decline to ban chlorpyrifos, despite years of scientific study and deliberation indicating that the pesticide poses a clear risk to children, farm workers, and users of rural drinking water. In doing so, the administration made a 180-degree turn from the EPA Office of Chemical Safety and Pollution Prevention's scientific conclusion that chlorpyrifos has harmful effects on children's brain development. In fact, the EPA banned the use of chlorpyrifos indoors in 2000, citing concerns for the health of children. Exposure to chlorpyrifos, which kills pests by interrupting the electrochemical processes in nerve cells, is already affecting families in Tulare County in California's Central Valley, where those who live and work close to fruit and nut orchards are particularly at risk. When farmers spray the chemical on crops, the resulting plumes drift into homes, schools, and workplaces in the surrounding area. Next slide, please. The administration is also very clearly putting profits over people. The Congressional Review Act, or CRA, was used in February to overturn the stream protection rule, rolling back requirements for mining companies to monitor conditions of nearby streams and exposing Americans to birth defects, cancer, and other health risks stemming from contaminated water. The image shows Lower Bat Creek in Leslie County, Kentucky, which has become contaminated since mountaintop removal mining began on the hills above it. Furthermore, the 2-for-1 executive order, in which 2 regulations are eliminated for every new regulation, is nonsensical, unscientific, and puts profits over people, emphasizing cost to industry while failing to consider benefits to the public. Next, please. The administration is also rolling back climate change safeguards. Policies to limit global warming emissions and prepare for and mitigate the impact of climate change are clear targets for President Trump. In its first 6 months, the administration weakened climate-related policies at several federal agencies. President Trump's decision to withdraw demonstrates a blatant disregard for the threat of climate change and the impact that Americans are already experiencing. Next. The Clean Air Act is not exempt from these attacks and interference on science. In May 2016, in response to a growing body of research showing the important contribution of methane emissions to global warming pollution in the U.S., the EPA issued a rule to set methane emission standards. But industry opposition from the American Petroleum Institute, Texas Oil and Gas Association, independent associations, and GPA Midstream Association prompted EPA Administrator Scott Pruitt to find fault with the methane rule and issued a 90-day stay of the compliance date for methane monitoring requirements. Similarly, implementation of the 2015 revised ozone standard has been delayed by the administration, again responding to pressure from industry associations that have cast doubts about the validity of long-held, solid science on the many public health benefits of reducing ground-level ozone. Next, please. How are these actions impacting environmental justice communities? We can see that the administration has engaged in a clear pattern of callous disregard for environmental justice communities. Many low-income communities and communities of color in the United States have not always enjoyed the environmental and public health benefits of environmental safeguards. These communities and their advocates have long demanded redress of the unequal environmental burdens they experience, and have been hopeful that the progress made under President Obama's EPA would continue and improve under a new administration. But those hopes were recently dashed by President Trump's proposed EPA budget, which allocates exactly $0 to environmental justice programs within the agency. Where will the environmental justice EPA work be housed? There are few details, but the proposed budget says it will be incorporated into the Integrated Environmental Strategy Program, which has provided assistance for environmental and public health initiatives in developing countries and has been supported by USAID. This clearly signals the incoherent position that the Trump administration sees environmental justice as a matter of foreign aid and development policy. Furthermore, as the IES program is housed under the EPA Office of the Administrator, it moves environmental justice matters closer to the source of political manipulation and disregard for science we have seen in Scott Pruitt's EPA. Next, please. But the scientific community has not been idle in the face of these attacks on health and environmental protections, and they have fought back. For example, a letter signed by 15,000 scientists told the administration that interference in science is unacceptable. Next, please. There are many more instances of political interference in science that are putting Americans at risk. I urge you to read our full report on how the Trump administration has been sidelining science since day one and threatening human and environmental health. I would like to follow up this sobering and quite depressing outlook for the future of public health with a more positive discussion of what we can do as scientists and advocates to push back against this agenda so destructive for human health. Next. Thank you very much.
I'm sorry, there was a little lag time in me unmuting my line, but thank you so much for setting the stage for this timely discussion, and I imagine there will be some lively discussion and some good questions at the end of the call. So again, for all of you listening, please hold your questions for the end. We'll have about 10 to 15 minutes for discussion at that time. And now I'd like to welcome and introduce Dr. Frederica Perera, Professor of Environmental Health Sciences and Director of the Columbia Center for Children's Environmental Health. Dr. Perera is internationally recognized for pioneering the field of molecular epidemiology, utilizing biomarkers to understand links between environmental exposures and disease. Currently, she and her colleagues are applying advanced molecular and imaging techniques within longitudinal cohort studies of pregnant women and their children, with the goal of identifying preventable environmental risk factors for developmental disorders, asthma, obesity, and cancer in childhood. These include toxic chemicals, pesticides, and air pollution, with particular focus on adverse effects of prenatal and early childhood exposures. She is the author of over 350 publications, including 300 peer-reviewed articles, and has received numerous honors. Welcome, Dr. Perera. You may go ahead and begin.
Thank you very much, Diana. I'm happy to be here, and thanks for asking me. I will talk about environmental threats to children's developing brains, and I will certainly emphasize some of the themes that Juan so eloquently discussed. My second slide, next slide, please, outline. I will give an overview of the problem. I will really emphasize the importance of scientific research, and I'll give some findings from our center, Columbia Center for Children's Environmental Health, as examples. I'll also discuss the call to action by Tender, a group of 50 scientists, pediatricians, other experts, and then discuss some present threats that we are seeing in the political setting, and talk about solutions. So the next slide, please. As to the scope of the problem, it is rather vast. More than 84,000 chemicals are in use today, and they were introduced largely, began to be introduced after World War II. Here's on this slide is a picture of children enjoying candy that's better because it's fresher with cellophane, and DuPont's Better Things for Better Living Through Chemistry from the 1950s or so. The fact is that, yes, there has been improvement from chemistry and better living in many ways, but we have a problem with this plethora of chemicals that are in use, and only 20% of them have been tested for any early developmental effects. Of the ones that have been tested, about 200 chemicals are documented to be neurotoxic. And so that's a big alarm bell, and we need to take steps to improve that drastically. The number of, here, the next slide shows the number of chemicals that are detected in U.S. pregnant women in a small study of some 54 participants, where 52 chemicals were tested for, and of those, 43 were detected rather routinely in the bodies of pregnant women. And they included cotinine, a metabolite of nicotine, and then metals, organochlorine pesticides, PBDE flame retardants, polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, combustion byproducts, and phthalates. So this study and many others indicate the fact of widespread exposure to pregnant women and their fetuses. We also know that there are rather striking and alarming disparities in exposure and susceptibility that affect low-income communities and communities of color, and they relate to air pollution, pollutants like the PAH, to pesticides and phthalates and other chemicals in buildings, food, and consumer products, and that these same communities experience more poverty-related material hardship, psychosocial stress, and inadequate nutrition, so they are less buffered and have co-exposures that can work alongside environmental exposures to increase risk. The next slide makes the point that the placenta and the blood-brain barrier are not fully protective, that a number of different chemicals do cross the placenta from the fetal side, from the maternal circulation to the fetal circulation, as shown on the left-hand side, and that the endothelial cells, which comprise the blood-brain barrier, they're a type of epithelial cells, do in fact allow the passage of certain gases and molecules to enter the brain extracellular fluid. So up to a few decades ago, we did think that these were quite fully protective. We now know that is not the case. And this is of concern, next slide please, because of the complexity of development of the human brain during the gestational period. So between the conception and 38, 40 weeks of development, there are many, many processes happening, very complex and happening at the same, in many cases at the same time. First, starting with the formation of the neural tube or neurulation, and then neuronal proliferation or proliferation of the nerve cells, their migration to where they need to go in the brain, and then the connections formed, synaptogenesis between them, and the trimming or pruning, as it's called, by apoptosis. Several of these processes do continue into childhood and even into adolescence, but you can see from the slide how very important those early steps are, and any disruption can have rather lasting and serious consequences. The next slide shows various factors in the increased susceptibility of the fetus to neurotoxicants. And without dragging you through the whole thing, the point is that the brain is very rapidly developing during this period, and most of the 90 billion neurons in the human brain, adult brain, are formed in the first month of life. So we have to be particularly concerned about any exposures that might disrupt that development. Cells are proliferating rapidly, putting DNA at risk, and the fetus is less able to get rid of toxicants once they are taken into the circulation, into the body. There are the defense mechanisms that operate in adults and older children are immature, and there's also very high vulnerability to co-exposures to psychosocial stressors, including those due to poverty. And then there's a lot of now awareness of the fact that diseases can be seeded, diseases that are long latency, even chronic diseases that develop in later life, can be seeded during those early months. In other words, the groundwork laid for later disease and impairment. There are also, next slide, there are multiple mechanisms by which in utero exposures can affect fetal development. And while they're listed separately here, I want to emphasize that they're not mutually exclusive, that many chemicals act via multiple mechanisms shown here, including directly damaging DNA and causing mutations, oxidative stress and inflammation, and then changes in what's called the epigenome, the way in which the genes are programmed through methylation and other processes, programmed to produce the proteins that they're meant to produce. That's a very simplistic way of putting it, but they're called epigenetic alterations. And then many chemicals, the endocrine disrupting chemicals, can interfere with normal hormonal pathways and disrupt this very complex endocrine system that is so critical in the first months of life in utero. Now, it's important to note that environmental exposures can interact with genes, with genetic susceptibility, and also with psychosocial stress. So, and again, I emphasize that they're not mutually exclusive, of course. Now, there have been disturbing trends in the prevalence of developmental disorders in children. Autism, ADHD, shown on this slide, have increased over recent decades, and these trends are not explained completely by better diagnosis. And 1 in about 6 U.S. children is affected by at least one such disorder. Next slide. And the burden has been growing. 15% of children, 1 in 6 in the U.S., are affected by disorders, not only ADHD and autism, but learning disorders or some intellectual disability. ADHD affects 10% of children in the U.S. with a very large societal cost and high annual cost per individual. And this is a pattern that we're seeing worldwide. A 20% global prevalence has been reported for child and adolescent mental disorders. And these increases have been seen globally as well as in the U.S. Now, I will have a few slides on the scientific research that our center, the Columbia Center for Children's Environmental Health, has been carrying out with funding from the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences, NEPA, that has funded a network of such children's environmental health centers that have been extremely important and valuable in generating important and policy-relevant information. And I show these results as examples of the kind of work that's being done around the country. And when I do show you a result on a particular chemical or exposure, you must be aware that these results are consistent with and supported by a wealth of other data from experimental and epidemiologic studies. So, and also I want to emphasize the importance of community-based research. We have had since 1998 at our founding, and when we started to enroll subjects into the study, we've had a very strong partnership with West Harlem Environmental Action, an environmental justice group here in New York City, and other community groups, so that our work is relevant and responsive to their needs. In the study, we enrolled 720 mother-child pairs, and moms are non-smoking and healthy, and they're African American and Dominican residents of northern Manhattan and the South Bronx. These are the communities that we serve. Mostly, they are low income and on Medicaid, and we've recruited them during pregnancy and collected maternal urine and blood. Prenatal personal air monitoring is shown on the lower left-hand side of the slide. A small backpack monitor, and collected cord blood and placental tissue at birth and blood and urine from the children periodically through their adolescence. Following children through adolescence, our oldest children are 18, almost 19. And so this has been a very long-term partnership that we've had both with community groups and WEAC and also with the mothers and children in the study. Next slide, please. This cartoon really shows that we have looked at a variety of exposures, the PAH, BPA, bisphenol A, and phthalates, which are both chemicals in various types of plastics and consumer products, environmental tobacco smoke, or ETS, PBDE, flame retardants, and CPF, which is chlorpyrifos, the insecticide that Juan referred to. And we have been studying the associations with a variety of adverse outcomes in the children, and I've highlighted the neurodevelopment here, but be aware that we're looking at multiple outcomes and the relationship among them. And we use this approach, molecular epidemiology, which means that to help us link these external exposures to the outcomes on the right of the slide, we use biomarkers such as the DNA adduct, it's called, formed when the PAH enter the bodies and actually are activated to bind to DNA and leave this sort of fingerprint. This is a cartoon, but the black smudge there in the middle of DNA is the chemical benzpyrene, one of the PAHs. We also look at epigenetic changes and have used MRI imaging of the brain to help us connect these two exposure and outcomes and understand the mechanisms better. So I'll briefly summarize the results for several of these exposures, again noting that they're supported in every case by studies in other populations and by a wealth of experimental data as well. So the prenatal exposure as monitored by backpack monitors shown at the upper right-hand side, or by measuring the fingerprint on DNA formed by PAH. The exposure has been linked to developmental delays at age 3 in the children, reduced IQ measured at age 5, behavioral problems ages 6 to 7, MRI brain changes at 7 to 9, and symptoms of anxiety, depression, and ADHD at age 9. Also recently reported that there have been links to emotional regulation capacity and a decrease in that function. And we have seen interactions between PAH and material hardship due to poverty, such that the women who were more exposed to these material hardships and higher levels of PAH were more likely to have children with developmental problems. I want to emphasize, without going into a ton of detail, that all analyses have adjusted for relevant covariates, both co-exposures in the environment and socioeconomic psychosocial factors. Next slide, please. The next finding I'll just briefly summarize is with respect to chlorpyrifos. Prenatal chlorpyrifos has been associated with lower birth weight, but also with reduction in working memory at age 7, changes in the structure of the brain measured at age 7 to 9 by MRI, and these brain changes are distinct from those seen with PAH, and they appear to explain the adverse neurodevelopmental effects of chlorpyrifos, and this work has been done by Robin Wyatt and Virginia Rao for the 3 bullets shown here. Next slide, please. Moving on to the next class of chemical contaminants, phthalates. Work by Pam Factor-Litvak and Robin Wyatt, led by those two, has evaluated the observed effects of phthalates and full-scale IQ measured at age 7. And they have broken up the exposure as measured by maternal urinary phthalate metabolites into quartiles and have compared the highest quartile, Q3, to the lowest, and have seen a decrement for MNBP, one of the major metabolites of phthalates, of almost 7 points, and for the MIBP, another such urinary metabolite, 7.6 points. These decrements, reductions in IQ score, this is full-scale IQ, are significant, statistically significant, and meaningful. They're in the range of low-level lead exposure, what's seen with low-level lead. The next slide summarizes some of our observed effects of prenatal exposure to BPA, bisphenol A. And we have seen, as others have, that there are neurobehavioral symptoms associated with this exposure and internalizing, externalizing problems, both with differential effects in boys and girls. In our study, more effects in boys, more increases, and opposite in girls. When we looked at anxiety and depression symptoms at age 9, we did see an association between prenatal BPA exposure and these outcomes only in the boys, and which is kind of consistent with what we had seen earlier. So again, as with all the other work I'm presenting, after adjusting for relevant covariates, as I outlined earlier. And finally, Julie Herbstman has led the work on PBDE, flame retardants, has looked at developmental scores, here are the mean developmental scores at 1 to 6 years, for major PBDEs, the BDEs 47, 99, and 100. And it's a busy slide, but you can see that there are reductions in scores for, on the left, the psychomotor development index and the mental development index are taken with the Bailey scales at 12 months, 24 months, 36 months of age. And then over on the right, the next two panels, full scale performance and verbal IQ at ages 4 and ages 6, respectively, a very consistent pattern of reduced scores, significantly reduced scores, again, adjusting for relevant covariates. And here she has compared the highest quintile to the lower 80%. Now, to cheer us up, some positive note. We and others have seen direct benefits of interventions. So for chlorpyrifos, after EPA banned the residential use of chlorpyrifos, used largely for roach control of other pests in apartments, housing, there was a sharp drop in the levels that we measured in cord blood of the newborns in our study as we sequentially enrolled them. And you can see that after 2001, there is a drop and down to almost nothing by 2003. And similarly, with respect to the air monitored data and the small backpack monitors I showed you earlier, in the New York City cohort, we've been able to track those exposures over time from 1998 here through 2006, and we're continuing to look at those trends. And during this period, during the Bloomberg years, there were some measures taken to reduce congestion and clean up diesel buses and other sources of pollution, PAH pollution, and we have seen and reported a decline over that period. The jury's still out on the future years, and we're working on that, but that was encouraging that policies and interventions can have direct impacts. And that's obviously, I mean, the best example is with lead levels in the blood of children in America following the ban in the 1970s. Another example is after California enacted a legislative ban on PBDE flame retardants, the levels in the blood and of pregnant mothers and then in breast milk declined sharply, so immediate benefits. But they're not just they're the health benefits, yes, but next slide shows that there are large economic benefits of prevention. There's a little typo in the title, don't be thrown off. It means to say large economic costs, which are potential benefits of prevention. So $76 billion is the estimated cost of childhood illness due to toxic chemicals and air pollutants in the U.S., 56 billion, more than 56 billion in 2008 for lead poisoning and prenatal mercury exposure in the U.S. again, and work analyzing exposures in the EU, European Union, estimated that prenatal organophosphate pesticide exposure cost about the equivalent of 164 billion each year in terms of children's functioning, cognitive functioning. And health impacts of air pollution and climate change in the U.S. have been estimated at from 360 to almost $900 billion a year due to U.S. fossil fuel electricity. So we can reap enormous benefits, financial benefits from protecting children from these exposures. The next slide comes from a legislative briefing that Tracy Woodruff presented in last spring, and a group of us did present on the Hill. And this slide shows that EPA rules affecting air, solid waste, emergency response, water, conveyed annual net benefits of about $622 billion. And obviously these dwarf the costs of enacting those rules. So very rich rewards. Last year in 2016, Project Tender, this group of 50 scientists, experts, of which I was one member, called Targeting Environmental Neurodevelopment Risks, issued a consensus statement. It's a call to action, and you can read it. It emphasized the need to overhaul how agencies in government and business assess risks, regulate chemicals in commerce, and how scientific evidence informs decision-making by government and the private sector. So 3 areas that need immediate improvement. And prime examples are some of those that I've just reviewed our findings on with respect to our center, and some others, organophosphate pesticides, the PBDEs, air pollution, lead, mercury, and PCBs. And those were cited as just examples, and the consensus statement noted the very many chemicals of concern. The next slide makes the point that rollbacks of rules and policies will directly harm children's health. So rollbacks on the rules on car emissions and power plant emissions and effluent standards, and failure to implement TSCA reform will lead to less efficient cars. Dirtier power plants, failure to implement reform will lead to more chemical contamination. And there'll be more toxic air pollution, accelerated climate change. And so this is no time to roll these things back. We have to be ever more vigilant. And the next slide just draws your attention to a very nice article in the New England Journal of Medicine by Jonathan Samet, Thomas Burke, and Bernie Goldstein, called The Wrong Direction, and emphasizing how science-based policies and regulations have resulted in tremendous gains in environmental quality and reduced exposure to harmful pollutants. I wrote some of these same things more briefly in an op-ed opinion piece in the New York Times in June, and talked about the womb is no protection from toxic chemicals or from, and children are especially vulnerable as well to climate change. So I wrapped these things together and talked about the importance of remaining vigilant, and the fact that the next slide is just conclusions. It's really what I just told you about, that particularly emphasizing interventions do work, and this is no time to relax vigilance. So when we go to the next slide, which is solutions, we can talk about these things. We need, obviously, sustained research. We need collaborative research. And that's been happening throughout the years with the Children's Environmental Health Centers, which have been like pearls in a necklace across the country. Very valuable source of data. And ECHO, this virtual consortium, environmental consequences on health outcomes, a very valuable initiative that's going on now, bringing together many different cohorts across the U.S. To combine their efforts, their energy, their data. Also, a solution is a very valuable aspect of this solution is partnerships with environmental justice communities who are most affected, most vulnerable to these exposures. We need to be sure that the Toxic Substance Control Act reform is implemented in a strong way, and very concerned about the possibility of that not happening. And also, we need sustainable energy policies and need to fight for those. Market reform is key. And then common sense solutions, as Linda Birnbaum said at a recent conference. Are we putting chemicals in places we don't need them? Why do we need flame retardants in nursing pillows and baby strollers? And so I will just acknowledge my colleagues. These are just a few of the important colleagues who contributed to this work and our partners. And also at the end, you'll see some citations to papers you might want to read to follow up on the role of environmental exposures in neurodevelopmental disorders. And thank you very much for your attention.
And thank you, Dr. Perera. We appreciate everything you shared with us and your research. So thank you so much for joining us today, and all of our participants as well. Now is the time when we invite questions and comments from our participants. So if you are listening and would like to ask a question, please press *2 to unmute your line. If you know who your question is directed to, then please say so when you ask it. And it's helpful if you state your name and affiliation as well. So the lines are open. Again, press *2 to unmute your line and ask your question. Then we do ask that you press *2 again to mute it, just so that we don't end up with a lot of background noise.
Hello?
Hello? Hello?
Yes, I do have a question for the doctor that just spoke. My name's Ginger from Pesticide Free Zone. Why is it that fluoride is never talked about when it is a neurotoxin as well as lead? Thank you.
Right. Well, I tell you, I believe it is talked about. We have not been studying fluoride in our own work, but there are studies going on with respect to fluoride. So I think that's an important question, but I can't speak to any work that we're doing in our own cohort.
Okay. Do we have some other questions out there? Other people who would like to make a comment or ask a question?
This is Mary Gant with Green Science Policy Institute and formerly at NIEHS. I think the data that you presented on the economic costs and benefits of taking control of our environmental exposures is really, really important. What's being done to publicize those numbers?
I agree with you. I think we don't do enough to talk about the potential benefits of action and get those numbers out. I try to do that in my own writing, and in the op-ed I certainly put in those numbers, at least some of them, and I think we need to do more of that as a group of researchers and then communicate those numbers, because they are very compelling. You're absolutely right. And other numbers that we can use, for example, David Bellinger at Harvard has estimated the IQ losses that could be estimated for just 3 chemicals: lead, methylmercury, and organophosphate pesticides. And they amount to 40 million points in total, 40 million IQ points lost for just these 3 exposures. Numbers like that are impressive, and I actually cited his paper in the last slide, so you could look that up. But I agree with you. These numbers speak for themselves, and we need more of them, more of those calculations, and that's something I plan to work on, pulling those numbers together and making sure that they're available to people who can use them.
Thank you. I think that's really important. The advocacy groups need to really pay attention to those numbers and put them out to their members.
I agree. And please, if you use this slide of mine, please correct the typo in the title, which is rather misleading.
Absolutely.
Dr. Perera, we can put up a corrected version if you'd like after the call.
Okay.
Do we have some other comments or questions? Perhaps some folks from Alaska?
Hi, this is Patty from Alaska. I just saw an article about the rollback of the Obama administration's newly clarified definitions of waters under the jurisdiction of EPA and expanding it to not just the main river, but the tributaries and wetlands associated with that river, that the headwaters, so to speak. And what it talked about was that Pruitt, the head of EPA, basically told the scientists in no uncertain terms to redo the report that showed the benefits of reducing pollution to those headwaters, the marshes, and the small tributaries, and to just delete that from the cost-benefit analysis to show that the cost of complying with this rule would be higher than the benefits. I assume that somebody in the environmental justice world will sue EPA over that, but I haven't heard anything about that. But it seems to me that litigation may be our best hope, and I'm wondering if, not just with this particular rule, but with other assorted rules. I know that there was just a lawsuit filed about the first two sets of regulations coming out under the TSCA reform that Dr. Perera mentioned. So I'm wondering if we can have some commentary on the effectiveness of litigation as a tool versus grassroots pressure on our elected officials.
This is Juan. I'd like to comment on that. I think, let's see, so litigation is certainly one part of effective pushback. If you think of the constellation of environmental advocacy and scientific organizations, such as Natural Resources Defense Council, Union of Concerned Scientists, Earth Justice, and a myriad of other large organizations, they use, some use that tool more than others. At UCS, we don't use that as much because we're mostly a scientific organization, but action alerts, contacting senators, if you're a scientist and getting involved through our science network, for example, to be on the list for receiving action alerts, to push back against some of these egregious attacks on science and environmental and public health, is certainly an important activity that can help. That is also effective in alongside the direct action that, for example, grassroots and frontline communities and environmental justice organizations take as well.
Thank you. Again, if you'd like to ask a question or make a comment, press *2 to unmute your line, and then press *2 again when you're finished.
Hi, this is Rosemary Atongarok. I'm from Noxit, and we're dealing with the oil and gas industry and our concerns around the current air quality assessment that's being done with ConocoPhillips. When industry is allowed to do modeling to project the concerns for our community, but key years of exposure are withheld from the modeling, or they utilize data that puts permits together that allows a project to be developed but does not include the various pieces that fully encompass the permit. There's a lot of misreading to the way that these models are being created, but yet they're being touted as being really scientifically strong in the process. How do we, as a small community with only 500 people here, combat that concern when they tell us only one will develop cancer in 1 million people, but we had 2 babies in 1 year develop cancer? I
think it's a common problem in the regulatory framework because it typically doesn't consider, I think that the air quality modeling that you're talking about is what permitted sources have to conduct typically to show that their activities are going to comply with the existing national ambient air quality standards, depending on the pollutant. But typically, each plant or source is regulated separately. There's no consideration of cumulative impacts. For example, if you have two separate companies that are asking for two separate permits, well, each one of those companies' environmental engineers send their or model their activity separately, and it doesn't consider what environmental justice folks have been talking about for a long time, which are cumulative impacts. And this is in the simplest case of those two sources. We know there are many other environmental impacts that environmental justice communities face. Now, how to I think one of the ways in which communities can engage with scientists is, for example, we do a lot of partnership development with communities and environment and scientists. We try to partner up scientists with communities, scientists who are interested in working with communities to help address some of these problems that have gone unaddressed. And I think that will be a very critical kind of activity that environmental justice communities will probably continue to do in the absence of a federal mandate or any kind of federal action on environmental justice matters, as we have seen in the proposed Trump EPA budget for environmental justice. And we can follow up offline. There's a lot of resources that UCS and the Center for Science and Democracy have developed to partner scientists with communities that wish to understand these issues and develop scientific information that is credible and can be used as effective leverage in advocacy activities.
Thank you. And I just want to say, this is Diana, the facilitator. Just want to say that in a follow-up email to everyone who signed up for the call, you'll receive a link to the recording, as well as I will compile some of these resources that are being mentioned throughout the call. I'll provide links to those various ways to take action or learn more. We do have time for one or two more questions, and then I have some final comments to make. So I would invite anyone who has not asked a question but has been thinking about it to step up. Press *2 to unmute your line.
Hi, this is Patrice Lee in Fairbanks. To the previous caller, we've been dealing with some of the dirtiest ambient air quality in the nation for years and years now, and I would invite you to connect with me. Everybody at ACAT has my contact information, but Patrice Lee 3294@gmail.com, because we may have some strategies that could assist you in this dilemma with dealing with the data that's not included when a modeling is done.
Great, thank you,
Thank you.
Patrice, for sharing that.
Thank you.
Hi, this is Kathy Blaustein calling from Ellison State University. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, it blipped out when you said where you were calling from. Perhaps you could say that again.
I'm calling from Corvallis, Oregon, Oregon State University.
Okay.
And I'm always struck when I listen to these kinds of presentations, which, by the way, were excellent. Thank you so much to both speakers. By the rural versus urban issues involved here, and the choice versus lack of choice. Corvallis is a fairly small town in the Willamette Valley. We have our issues with pollution, as every place does, but when I look at some of the issues that arise for these pregnant women living in Manhattan and the Bronx and these heavily populated areas, communities of poverty where people have very few choices to leave the area, to create situations where they don't have to breathe the air so often, their housing, their available diets, all of these things, it seems to me far less choice. And I just wondered if that's ever been, if anybody's ever thought about, just almost as an illustration of what can be achieved health-wise, the differences that you see in exposure levels if you compare a more rural population or even small city to some of these large metro areas where the issues are even more extreme. That's my question, or my comment at least. Thank you.
Sure. This is a good comment. Clearly, there are urban-rural differences. We're partnering in a small study with the Children's Environmental Health Center at Dartmouth in New Hampshire to look at some of the biologic markers of exposure that in umbilical cord blood that can be related to various environmental exposures that would differ between New York City and rural Hanover, New Hampshire. And that will be interesting, using the same methods and methodology and biomarkers to make those comparisons. There are very few such direct, comparisons that are being done, have been done so far, but I think that's important. But the exposures do differ in various communities, and we don't think that rural communities are without their risks. Certainly, risks of pesticide exposure, diesel emissions from heavy farm equipment, and so forth. It's just that the patterns are different, and but you certainly raise a good point, and we need to look more at those differences and the effects of choice. Also, I think it's important that we do pay attention to studies that have looked at interventions and the benefits of interventions, including behavioral change, including greater awareness of environmental risks, as well as the policy changes that I've focused on in my talk. All those things can contribute, can provide that kind of education, and intervention can provide choices. And there's perhaps not enough of that work going on. And all of this, all of the comments and everything that we've all talked about in this hour just emphasize the importance of continued support to research, to interventions, and to communicating risks and remedies, solutions to different communities, including those most vulnerable. And making the point that this is no time to relax our work, our vigilance, and stop the work that we're all doing, and we have to fight for that.
Thank you, Dr. Perera. That's a good note to end on. I would like to give Juan an opportunity for any final words that you'd like to share with us before I make my final wrap-up comment.
Well, I'd just like to thank Che Alaska again for providing this space and communicating this information. And we'll be in touch through Diana then with more information on how to help. Like Dr. Perera said, stay vigilant and do our part to push back on these attacks on public health. Thank you.
Great, thank you. And I did receive the resources that you shared, and I'll make sure to share those with our listeners. And here's something that you can do. We know that the EPA is facing devastating budget cuts that threaten our drinking water and clean air. The Alaska Senators Murkowski and Sullivan need to hear from you. And so without your voice, we could lose protections for the most vulnerable Alaskans, especially pregnant women, children, and people living in the Arctic. We could lose safe drinking water and sewage treatment in rural Alaska, and we could lose state grants that fund Alaska's IGAP environmental coordinators. So a well-funded EPA means healthy children and strong communities, and we will be calling upon you to take action in contacting our senators. Alaska Community Action on Toxics is working on this right now. So please stay tuned for more information and let us know if you'd like to be involved. You can call our office at 907-222-7714 or email info@akaction.org. And again, I just want to thank all of you for participating, thank our speakers for their time in preparing and presenting today. And as always, I'd like to ask you to consider making a donation to Alaska Community Action on Toxics in support of our monthly Che Alaska calls. Your contribution of just $10 or $20 or more will help provide the support we need to continue bringing you these calls throughout the year. You can give online at akaction.org. If you have additional questions or comments, please feel free to contact us. Again, the phone number is 907-222-7714. You can contact me by email at Diana, that's with one N, at akaction.org. And thanks again to everyone. Look for a follow-up email with a recording and additional resources, and have a wonderful day. Thank you again for participating.